Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the past, your sandals crunching on uneven stones as you step into the Roman Forum. Torches flicker in iron brackets, smoke curling like restless spirits into the night sky. Crowds press in from every side, the voices of merchants mixing with the smell of roasted chestnuts, sweat, and something less appetizing, probably goat dung. You edge closer, curious, and realize you're standing before one of Rome's slave markets. Men, women, and children are herded onto wooden platforms, eyes darting nervously as auctioneers rattle off descriptions. You feel the prickling unease of watching lives treated like merchandise, each person given a price tag. It's a spectacle that hums with energy and cruelty in equal measure, and you, the modern onlooker, probably won't survive a single day if you try to blend into this world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and your local time down below. I love seeing where and when people tune in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The marketplace is alive with clamor. Picture sellers chalking quick notes onto wooden tablets, details about age, skill, origin, like you're scanning a grocery shelf. A boy from Thrace is tagged as strong field worker, a young woman from Greece, educated, suitable for teaching children. One man with a crooked leg is shoved forward with little ceremony. You can guess his price will not soar. Some buyers poke and prod like they're shopping for horses, tugging arms to check muscle tone, prying mouths open to examine teeth. This was not a polite transaction. It was closer to an inspection line at a cattle fair, though the stakes here were painfully human. And the shocking truth? These scenes weren't rare. Rome had entire zones dedicated to such sales, like the Forum Venalium, where traders specialized in importing and auctioning enslaved people. Historians still argue whether the market atmosphere was more business as usual or an overwhelming circus-like frenzy, but either way, the sound of the auctioneer's hammer was familiar background music to Roman daily life. You'd see the whole spectrum of humanity up there on the blocks. Some of the captives had been dragged across continents after wars, their fates sealed by a general's victory. Others were children born into slavery, knowing no other life. Still others were victims of debt, betrayal, or bad luck, swept into this machinery of trade. And every single one of them stood under those torches with a sign tied around their neck, for sale. One mainstream fact that surprises many people is that Romans actually had laws requiring transparency in these sales. If a slave was sick or prone to run away, the seller had to disclose it or risk being dragged into court later by an angry buyer. It's like an ancient version of a lemon law, except here the product was a breathing person. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sellers smeared chalk or even flour on slaves' feet to signal they were newly imported, like a label screaming, "Fresh shipment." Imagine walking into a modern store and finding produce dusted with powder just to prove it was exotic. That's the level of marketing spin you're witnessing here. As you shuffle closer, the auctioneer raises his voice. A brawny man from Gaul is hauled up. Bidding starts fast. Shouts echo from the crowd. Coins clink. Promises are made. The hammer falls, and in that instant, a life changes hands. You think about how many times this scene repeated each week, each year, until the slave population of Rome ballooned into the millions. Some historians still debate whether slaves ever outnumbered free citizens in Italy itself. But what's clear is that Rome was built on this endless supply of labor. You keep walking, your sandals brushing the dust, and everywhere you turn, another block rises. Children with wide eyes clutch each other, waiting to be separated. An old woman mutters under her breath, maybe cursing, maybe praying. The crowd shifts as another sale begins. The economy of an empire hums along, powered by human suffering, and you realize, to Romans, this was as normal as buying bread. And while the weight of it presses on you, the night is still strangely mesmerizing. Torches sputter. Voices swell. Somewhere, a drunk shouts at the moon. And here you are, standing among it all, trying to imagine the cost of a life in denarii, as if it were a loaf of bread or a jug of wine. You edge further into the crowd, and your ears catch the unmistakable rhythm of bidding. One man shouts, another counters, and the numbers climb like a drumbeat. It isn't just the spectacle that pulls you in tonight, it's the question pounding in your mind. How much did a Roman slave actually cost? You look around at the flickering torches, the chalk-marked feet of the newly arrived, the calculating stares of wealthy buyers, and you realize you're standing in an ancient version of a stock exchange, except the shares here are people. The average Roman slave, the kind brought in chains from wars or born in captivity, might sell for 500 to 2,000 sesterces. To put that in perspective, that's about 1 to 2 years' pay for a common soldier. Imagine working every day under the scorching Mediterranean sun, eating barley gruel and saving every coin, only to realize your entire salary might barely cover the purchase of a single laborer. And for wealthy landowners, snapping up a handful of cheap farmhands was just good business. Buy 10, and you've multiplied your workforce overnight. Historians still argue whether these numbers held steady across the empire or fluctuated wildly depending on the year, the city, or the sheer luck of the seller. After all, ancient Rome didn't have a tidy government-issued price list. What we know comes from scattered references in letters, plays, and legal contracts. It's like trying to figure out the cost of a laptop today by only checking what a few people scribbled on receipts 2,000 years from now. A mainstream fact to anchor you. In the 1st century CE, the Roman writer Columella noted that field slaves could often be purchased for about 1,000 sesterces, a price low enough that medium-sized estates could run with dozens of them. And remember, Rome's elite owned estates the size of small towns. If you're picturing Jeff Bezos rolling his eyes at the cost of a few tractors, you're not far off from the mindset of a senator buying cheap farm labor. But here's where things twist. You might also stumble upon a flashy Greek tutor with impeccable handwriting and a library in his head. He wouldn't go for a measly 1,000 sesterces. No, this man could fetch 20,000 or even 30,000. That's like comparing the price of a used car to a fully loaded sports car. The Romans knew talent when they saw it, and talent demanded a higher price tag. One quirky tidbit that makes you chuckle. Slaves were sometimes sold with warranties. Not the extended coverage you buy for your smartphone, but actual promises written into contracts, guaranteeing that the slave wasn't a runaway or cursed with epilepsy. If the warranty proved false, the buyer could sue for damages. Imagine trying to return your faulty slave like you'd return a broken toaster. It's absurd, unsettling, and very Roman. As you stand there, a hush falls. A young man is led onto the stage. His shoulders are broad, his skin sunbrowned, and the seller boasts loudly of his skills in farming. Bidding starts at 800 sesterces. The crowd stirs, numbers rise, and in a blur of hands and shouts, the hammer drops at 1,200. Just like that, another life is reduced to a figure scratched on a wax tablet. You can almost hear the arithmetic in buyers' minds. Is this person strong enough to last 10 harvests? Smart enough to be trained? Docile enough not to rebel? Every coin dropped is both a gamble and an investment. And you realize average prices aren't just numbers. They're little windows into how Romans valued human lives, weighing strength, obedience, and potential productivity, like items on a balance sheet. Somewhere behind you, a senator in a flowing toga jokes about his last purchase. A cook who burned soup on day 1. The crowd laughs. You shake your head, thinking about how fragile this whole economy really is. Historians still debate whether Rome's reliance on such cheap human labor stunted its technological growth. Why invent machines when you could just buy another person for the price of a donkey? And as the torches hiss and sputter, you notice the range. On one platform, a frail old woman sells for less than 500 sesterces, barely more than a week's rent in a modest Roman apartment. On another, a skilled secretary is bid up to 10,000, his handwriting praised like gold leaf. You realize you're not in one market, you're in dozens of overlapping markets, each with its own rules, its own logic, its own cold calculations. The crowd begins to disperse for the night, coins jingling in purses, chains rattling as new owners lead their purchases away. You remain for a moment, watching as the torches burn lower. The question echoes in your head. How much is a life worth? Tonight, in Rome, the answer was scrawled in chalk and counted in sesterces, numbers rising and falling like the tide. The next morning, you're back among the marble colonnades, dust swirling as merchants set up stalls. The clatter of bronze coins rattles in your ears, and you start noticing something peculiar. Not all slaves are created equal in the Roman economy. Some cost barely more than a mule, while others carried price tags that could make a senator wince. You drift closer to one of the platforms, where the auctioneer's voice carries over the crowd, and suddenly the divide between luxury and labor becomes impossible to ignore. A rough-looking man with calloused hands is brought forward first. His tunic is little more than rags, and the seller announces him as a field worker, nothing fancy, but sturdy. The bidding climbs sluggishly, ending around 1,000 sesterces. That's the price of sweat, muscle, and endless ploughing in the hot Italian sun. Field hands were the backbone of Rome's agricultural machine, cheap enough to buy in bulk, like stocking up on grain. If he broke down after a decade, another could be purchased without much fuss. But then, cue the drum roll, the tone changes. A Greek youth steps onto the block, his hair neatly trimmed, his scrolls tucked under his arm like props. The auctioneer boasts that this man can read Homer, teach rhetoric, and even dabble in philosophy. Instantly, the bids jump to 15,000, then 20,000 sesterces. By the time the hammer falls at 28,000, jaws in the crowd are tight. You whistle under your breath. That's 30 years of a soldier's pay, all for a single human brain, packaged in a toga. Historians still argue whether educated Greek slaves really transformed Roman culture or simply provided elite families with bragging rights. What's certain is that wealthy Romans saw them as investments worth every coin. A well-trained tutor didn't just teach children. He polished their social status. Imagine the Roman equivalent of hiring a private Ivy League professor to homeschool your kids. It wasn't about practicality. It was about prestige. And the contrast goes even further. You glance to one side where cooks, musicians, and hairdressers are paraded like jewels. A skilled chef could cost 10,000 sesterces or more. Why? Because food was everything at Roman banquets. If your cook could whip up flaming dormice or delicately seasoned peacock tongues, you weren't just feeding guests. You were staging theatre on a plate. Owning such talent was a way to flex, a culinary Rolex on legs. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some slaves specialized in remembering dinner guests' names and preferences. Think of them as human Rolodexes. A host could turn to one and whisper, "What's that senator allergic to again?" And the slave would provide the answer. Buyers shelled out high sums for these walking apps, and you can almost hear Roman aristocrats bragging, "Oh yes, mine never forgets who prefers Falernian wine watered down." Meanwhile, the agricultural workers, those sweating on vineyards or wheat fields, remained cheap and plentiful. They were Rome's invisible engine, producing the bread and wine that kept the empire going. Yet their prices rarely soared. Why pay thousands for someone who plows when war captives pour in every season to keep the supply high? The crowd surges as another specialty is brought forward, a scribe. His hands are ink-stained, his wax tablets filled with neat columns of letters. Bidding spikes quickly. Paperwork is the hidden lifeblood of empire, and wealthy Romans needed documents, contracts, and correspondence managed with care. Some scribes fetched 15,000 sesterces, their value lying not in muscle, but in meticulous pen strokes. One mainstream fact, under Emperor Augustus, it's recorded that the state itself spent fortunes on educated slaves for administrative work. They were cheaper than hiring freeborn citizens, but skilled enough to keep the machinery of government spinning. That tells you everything. Rome trusted its empire not just to senators, but to people who, legally, were considered property. As you watch, a man in the crowd mutters complaints about the rising costs of luxury slaves. He grumbles that it's ruining the market for average buyers. The irony isn't lost on you. Even in ancient Rome, people complained about inflation. Historians still debate whether these spikes in price reflected genuine scarcity or simply the vanity of elites outbidding one another in status games. And then comes the moment of absurdity. A young woman with beautiful hair is presented. The auctioneer shouts about her talents as a hairstylist, claiming she can sculpt braids that rival marble statues. The crowd laughs, the bids shoot up, and she's sold for the cost of a small villa. You shake your head, realizing that in Rome, beauty wasn't just admired, it was commodified, priced and paraded. As the day winds down, you've seen it all: the cheap farmhand, the priceless Greek tutor, the cook worth his weight in garum sauce. The gulf between luxury and labor isn't just wide, it's a canyon. And standing here, torchlight flickering against stone walls, you can almost hear the echo of coins clinking as Romans decided, one bid at a time, what was worth more: muscle, mind, or beauty. The torches burn low, and yet the market feels louder than ever. You notice wagons creaking into the square, loaded not with goods but with people, dirty, exhausted, and chained together. The smell of sweat, blood, and road dust hangs heavy. These are war captives, dragged across continents, and they're about to turn the market upside down. Picture it. A Roman general wins a campaign in Gaul, or perhaps in the east against Parthia. Tens of thousands of prisoners are rounded up, marched back to Italy, and dumped into the marketplace like a tidal wave of forced labor. When the supply skyrockets, the prices crash. Suddenly, that average 1,000 sesterce farmhand might sell for half as much, maybe even a quarter, if the market is flooded enough. It's simple economics, though simple feels grotesque when the currency is human lives. One mainstream fact worth holding on to: after the Third Macedonian War in 168 BCE, it's estimated that 150,000 captives were hauled into slavery. Think about that, an entire city's population suddenly for sale. Prices dropped so low that some Romans joked slaves were cheaper than a donkey. You imagine the panic of slave dealers who had been hoping for fat profits, only to watch their merchandise devalue overnight. But here's a quirky tidbit. Generals themselves sometimes staged sales to show off their triumph. Imagine walking through Rome and seeing a parade one week. Victory banners, golden spoils, cheering crowds, and then realizing the very people you saw in chains during the triumph are now standing on the auction blocks. Their price tags slashed like end-of-season sales. Romans even invented special festivals where war captives were part of the entertainment, blurring the line between victory celebrations and human trafficking. You catch snippets of conversation among the buyers around you. One boasts that he purchased 3 strong Thracians for the price of a single mule. Another sneers that barbarians make terrible workers, always scheming to escape. Historians still argue whether ethnic stereotypes influenced bidding or whether buyers simply went for the cheapest bodies available, but you can feel the bias in the air. To these Romans, nationality wasn't just identity, it was a financial metric. The auctioneer's hammer comes down again and again, but tonight it's not the sharp clash of high bids. It's a dull rhythm, sales closing at low numbers because there are just too many bodies to sell. You watch a mother clutch her child, both sold together for barely 600 sesterces. Your stomach twists. The crowd cheers. Think of the ripple effects. Wealthy landowners seize the chance to stock up, buying dozens of slaves at bargain prices. Their estates swell, vineyards expand, and Rome's agricultural output surges. At the same time, small farmers, those freeborn Romans who once worked their own plots, find themselves squeezed. How can they compete with estates powered by armies of enslaved labor bought on the cheap? Some historians claim this flood of slave labor pushed free citizens off their land and into the overcrowded city, swelling Rome's infamous slums. And yet, amid all this tragedy, the market keeps humming like a machine. You overhear one trader joke that the gods must love war, because nothing fattens a dealer's purse quite like a victorious campaign. Another laughs, claiming he can barely keep track of all the new names, so he brands initials into their skin to mark his stock. The crowd roars with amusement. You shudder because to you, the scars look less like accounting and more like cruelty etched forever. As you drift further, you see a strange contrast. On one side, the war captives sell at rock-bottom prices, while in the next stall, a specialized Greek tutor still fetches 20,000 sesterces. The flood of cheap bodies never really touches the rarities, the luxury items of the human marketplace. Just as today, luxury resists inflation. Romans could buy dozens of exhausted Gauls for pennies, but a witty playwright or a dazzling singer remained out of reach for all but the wealthiest. The sun dips low, casting long shadows across the forum. A wagon creaks past you, filled with captives too weary to resist, their eyes hollow. You can almost hear the creak of coins being counted in the background, buyers congratulating themselves on their bargains. The math of Rome is cruel. Victory in battle meant profit in the marketplace, and profit meant power at home. Somewhere, a senator leans on his staff and chuckles. Why invent machines when we can win wars? The crowd laughs, but you sense a grim irony. Historians still debate whether Rome's dependence on this endless supply of war captives prevented it from developing new technologies. Why innovate when conquest provided all the labor you could ever need? As night closes in, the market finally begins to empty. Torches flicker, chains rattle, and slaves are herded into their new owners' homes. You stand in the dust, realizing how fragile the value of a life was in Rome, rising and falling not with personal worth, but with the tide of war. The next day, you wander back into the Forum Vanalium, your sandals dragging through yesterday's dust. The air already hums with chatter, but something feels different today. You notice smaller figures climbing onto the wooden platforms, children. Their wide eyes blink against the morning light, and suddenly you realize you're about to witness a corner of the market even more unsettling: the buying and selling of the young. Children were often considered bargains in the Roman slave economy. A boy of 10 might fetch only a few hundred sesterces, sometimes even less than a donkey. The reasoning was simple. Children weren't immediately useful for hard labor. They required years of feeding, clothing, and training before they could contribute much. But buyers weren't foolish. They knew that investing in a child meant shaping a worker exactly to their household's needs. You could mold them into a loyal servant, a literate secretary, or even, with luck, a specialized artisan. Historians still argue whether Roman buyers truly valued child slaves as long-term investments or simply saw them as disposable. The sources are frustratingly inconsistent. In some records, wealthy families pay high prices for promising youths, hoping to groom them into skilled tutors or household managers. In others, children are lumped in with livestock, sold in batches like piglets. You overhear an auctioneer shouting, his voice cracking over the din. "Strong boy, Gaulish. No defects, only 8 years old." Bidding rises sluggishly, ending at 400 sesterces. The buyer, a plump merchant with gold rings, pats the child's head like he just purchased a puppy. You wince. A mainstream fact to ground this scene: Roman law technically prohibited the sale of freeborn Roman children into slavery, but poverty often pushed families to abandon or expose infants. Wealthy households scooped them up, and once absorbed into the system, their origins blurred. By the time they stood on a block like this, no one questioned their status. They were simply part of the merchandise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some buyers tested children by giving them puzzles or memory tasks on the spot. Imagine standing in chains, being asked to recite the alphabet to boost your price. In a society that valued both obedience and wit, a clever child could catch the eye of a wealthy patron, turning a low starting bid into a small fortune. Of course, not every child was so lucky. Many were destined for menial labor, sweeping floors, carrying water, or running errands until their backs grew strong enough for heavier tasks. Girls often faced harsher fates, purchased as domestic workers or, more darkly, as companions for their owners. Prices for girls sometimes dipped even lower, reflecting a brutal economy where supply was endless and demand often exploitative. You drift toward a group of buyers huddled around a teenage boy. His arms show signs of farm labor, muscles forming early. The bidding starts higher, quickly climbing to 1,000 sesterces. He's old enough to work, young enough to endure decades of toil. One bidder smirks, whispering that the boy will pay for himself within 2 harvests. It's chilling to hear lives reduced to return on investment math, like calculating how long it takes for a plow to earn back its cost. Historians still debate whether child slaves were treated more gently, given their youth, or more harshly, seen as malleable clay. Evidence hints at both extremes. Some masters educated and trained children into positions of trust, while others treated them as expendable tools. The truth, as always, likely depends on the household and the temperament of the owner holding the purse strings. The crowd thins as a mother and 2 small children are brought forward together. You catch your breath, wondering if they'll be sold as a family. Sometimes sellers offered discounts to keep groups together, but more often buyers cherry-picked what they wanted. A wealthy woman waves her hand, buying the older child for 600 sesterces. The younger is tugged away in tears, sold to a different buyer for 300. The mother, she's snapped up by yet another. Chains rattle as they're separated. You hear the clink of coins and feel your stomach twist. And yet, the market grinds on. Buyers bargain, sellers shout, children shuffle forward. One trader brags about purchasing 3 young girls for the cost of a single farmhand, promising they'll be trained in the kitchen. His friend chuckles, calling it a wise investment. The casual cruelty is dizzying. By evening, the platforms are nearly empty. You watch as the children are herded away, their small feet kicking up dust as they vanish into Rome's maze of alleyways and villas. Some will grow up as loyal household servants, others as scribes, and many in endless toil. You can't help but wonder which is worse, being bought cheaply with no expectations, or fetching a high price that ties your fate to elite ambitions. Either way, the cost of childhood in Rome was measured not in innocence, but in sesterces. The next morning, the clamour rises earlier than usual. You follow the flow of people into the square, and immediately your ears catch a different tone in the auctioneer's chant. Today's offerings aren't just brawny farm hands or frightened children. Today, you're staring at Rome's most valuable merchandise, skilled specialists. The energy shifts, and you sense you've entered the high-stakes corner of the human marketplace. A man steps forward, dressed in a tunic surprisingly clean for the occasion. His hands bear the faint scars of precise work, and the seller declares him a physician. The crowd stirs. Even in antiquity, healthcare was prized. Bidding starts high, 10,000 sesterces, and quickly leaps past 20,000. One senator raises his hand at 35,000, and the hammer falls. You can almost hear the man's sigh of resignation. Sold for a sum that could have bought a whole estate in the countryside. A mainstream fact grounds this scene. Skilled Greek doctors in Rome sometimes fetched prices above 50,000 sesterces. That's astronomical compared to the 1,000 sesterces farmhand. Why? Because Romans loved to flaunt cultured, educated slaves who could not only heal their bodies, but also advertise their sophistication. Imagine inviting guests over and casually mentioning, "Oh yes, our family physician is Greek-trained." Instant status boost. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some Roman doctors, technically slaves, became so trusted that they secretly treated their masters' rivals, or even their masters themselves, in ways that blurred loyalty and danger. Whispers circulated about poisons disguised as medicine. It was risky business, but it added a layer of mystery to their value. After all, if your doctor is also your slave, who really holds the power? The procession continues. A young man shuffles forward, carrying styluses and wax tablets. He's a scribe, trained to record accounts, copy manuscripts, and draft legal documents. You hear the bids climb to 12,000 sesterces. Owning such a person meant you could outsource the boring paperwork of empire while impressing guests with letters penned in flawless script. Historians still argue whether scribes should be seen as mere clerks or as silent architects of Rome's bureaucracy, but either way, their prices reflect their importance. Then comes the artisan. His hands are calloused but steady, his eyes sharp with precision. The auctioneer brags of his mosaics, images so detailed they make marble floors shimmer like paintings. The bidding erupts. 15,000, 18,000, 22,000. Finally, he's sold for 25,000 sesterces, enough to keep an average family fed for generations. You glance at the buyer, a wealthy matron practically glowing with pride, already envisioning her villa sparkling with priceless floors. The difference between luxury and utility strikes you hard here. Yesterday, children were sold for the cost of a donkey. Today, one artisan just sold for the cost of an entire vineyard. The contrast is dizzying. And yet you realize it makes sense. Romans were practical but also deeply performative. A cheap farmhand kept the bread flowing. But a doctor or artist? That displayed your wealth and culture for all to see. Nearby, a knot of men gossip about tutors. A Greek philosopher, fluent in Latin too, one boasts. Worth every denarius, another snorts, saying he'd never pay more than 10,000 for a man who talks too much. The crowd laughs, but the truth is clear. Educated slaves could fetch prices upward of 30,000 sesterces, sometimes even more if they came from Athens, Rhodes, or Alexandria. Their pedigree mattered almost as much as their skills. And then, the darker side. A skilled female musician steps forward, lyre in hand. Her voice, sweet as honey, floats over the crowd. The bids rise quickly. 15,000, 20,000, 27,000. The winner beams as though he's just secured a piece of living art. But you notice the undercurrent, the way buyers whisper about her beauty as much as her skill. In Rome, talent and objectification often blurred, turning the person into both performer and possession. One senator grumbles beside you. "Too much coin for one head," he mutters, "when the countryside runs on the cheap ones." He's thinking like an investor, weighing bulk versus brilliance. Historians still debate whether these massive prices for skilled slaves reflected genuine scarcity or merely social one-upmanship. Was the artisan truly worth more than 20 farmhands, or was it just another Roman status game? As the day wears on, the platform empties. The most talented have been snapped up at dizzying sums. The crowd drifts away, leaving you in the fading torchlight, coins still echoing in your ears. You think about the wild disparity, some lives valued like scraps, others like treasures. The math of Rome was ruthless, but also strangely familiar. After all, even today, a superstar athlete earns more in a week than a teacher does in a year. Rome's market wasn't so alien after all. It just priced human lives in sesterces instead of salaries. The morning haze clings to the city as you drift back into the market. And this time, your ears prick up at the auctioneer's exaggerated tone. He isn't just shouting about skills or strength. He's advertising where these slaves come from. Origins, you realize, are part of the sales pitch, and sometimes the difference between a bargain and a fortune. On the block, today stands a tall man with pale skin and reddish hair. The seller declares proudly, a Briton, strong, hardy, brave in battle. The crowd murmurs. Some buyers nod approvingly, whispering about northern toughness. Others frown, muttering that Britons are slow learners. Bids start modestly, climbing to only 900 sesterces before the hammer falls. You notice the buyer looks more excited about the novelty than the utility, like he's picked up a rare collectible. Next, a slender youth steps forward, his tunic draped with unusual elegance. The seller all but sings, "From Greece!" Fluent in poetry, knows letters, trained in music. The bids shoot up instantly, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 sesterces. When the gavel drops at 23,000, the crowd bursts into chatter. A Greek origin, you realize, was practically a brand name. Romans associated Greece with culture, intellect, and sophistication. If Britain was the rough-and-tumble label, Greece was the Gucci logo of the ancient world. A mainstream fact fits here neatly. Greek slaves were consistently valued more highly than most others, especially if they came from educated cities like Athens or Rhodes. Wealthy Romans wanted that aura of refinement in their households, and owning a Greek tutor or artist was the ultimate flex. But quirky tidbits abound too. You overhear one merchant joking that Syrian slaves were prized for their weaving, while others swore Cappadocians made the best stable hands. Some stereotypes were oddly specific. One text even suggests Phrygians were naturally suited to music. It's as if Rome turned entire ethnicities into marketing slogans, hawked at auction blocks like brand identities. You watch another sale unfold. A woman from the east, perhaps Judea or Syria, is paraded forward. The auctioneer highlights her exotic clothing and claims she knows local healing rituals. The bids creep upward, not as high as for a Greek, but respectable. The buyer beams, whispering to his companion about impressing dinner guests with her mystical knowledge. You roll your eyes. The Romans loved to flaunt the foreign, even when they barely understood it. Historians still argue whether these price differences were based on actual skill sets or simply Roman prejudices. Did Cappadocians really make better horse trainers, or was it just a stereotype repeated until it felt true? Either way, you see the consequences in real time, coin purses opening wider for some, barely jingling for others. A group of dark-haired men from Egypt are pushed forward next. The seller crows about their knowledge of irrigation and farming. Bids climb steadily. Rome depended heavily on Egypt's grain supply, and the association gave Egyptian slaves a reputation for agricultural expertise. You hear the hammer drop at 1,800 sesterces, a solid price for laborers. One buyer mutters that they'll work well on the Nile of Italy, whatever that means. And then, the spectacle. A striking woman from the Far East, her features unfamiliar to most Romans, steps onto the block. Gasps ripple through the crowd. The seller, smelling opportunity, spins tales of her exotic homeland. The bids rise quickly, far beyond her practical skills, until she's sold for a sum that would have bought 3 farmhands. In that moment, you realize how much novelty itself could inflate prices. Rome's appetite for the unusual often outweighed logic. One senator beside you shakes his head, scoffing. "Foreigners," he mutters. "They never learn Latin properly." His friend counters, "But they impress at parties." The two laugh. You can't decide which is worse, the prejudice or the casual commodification. By the end of the day, the market looks like a mosaic of the empire itself. Gauls, Britons, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, each stamped with stereotypes, each given a price tag reflecting not just their body, but their birthplace. You realize Rome wasn't just conquering territory. It was importing identities, packaging them for sale, and feeding its own sense of superiority. The torches flare as evening creeps in. You hear the clink of coins one last time before the crowd disperses. The thought lingers. In Rome, where you came from could determine whether you were sold as cheap muscle or paraded as cultured treasure. Origins became currency, and bias was baked into the math of the market. The next day dawns with a different kind of electricity. As you weave through the crowd, the air feels almost theatrical. The auctioneer doesn't just shout about strength or skills. He croons, flatters, practically sings. And then you see why. Today's offerings are not ploughmen or scribes, but beauty and entertainment. The market suddenly feels less like a barnyard and more like a stage. A young woman steps up first, her hair glinting in the sunlight, her tunic deliberately cut to reveal her figure. The seller praises her voice, her dancing, her grace. Bids leap like sparks. 8,000, 12,000, 15,000 sesterces. When the hammer falls at 18,000, the buyer beams like he's secured a jewel. You shake your head. This wasn't just a purchase. It was a performance, and everyone in the market knew it. Mainstream fact. Romans valued entertainers so highly that some musicians, dancers, or actors were sold for prices rivaling doctors and teachers. These weren't background workers. They were investments in prestige. A noble throwing a banquet wanted guests dazzled by live performances, not yawning into their wine. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some Romans collected entertainers the way modern fans collect concert tickets. Pliny the Elder even describes wealthy men bragging about owning multiple lyre players or mimes, like assembling an all-star playlist in human form. You can almost hear one of them saying, "Oh, you haven't heard my Syrian flautist yet? You simply must come by on Tuesday." But beauty wasn't just about music or dance. Attractive slaves were marketed openly as status symbols. On the block, you see a tall youth with curly hair and fine features. The auctioneer whispers about companionship in addition to his skills. The bids soar. His final price? 25,000 sesterces, enough to fund a legionary's entire career. The crowd murmurs approval, half envious, half scandalized. Historians still argue whether these inflated prices reflected genuine demand for talent or whether beauty was simply fetishized as a commodity in itself. Was that singer truly worth 20 times the price of a farmhand? Or was the market driven by vanity and desire? You glance around the crowd and suspect the latter. Another example shuffles forward. A young boy dressed in colorful fabric, holding a small set of pipes. The seller boasts of his music and bids rise quickly. One man, already drunk in the morning sun, shouts that he'll pay double if the boy can play a tune on the spot. The child hesitates, blows a few wavering notes, and the crowd erupts in laughter. The bid is accepted. It feels less like an auction and more like a twisted talent show. The spectacle continues. A dancer from Spain swirls across the platform, moving with fluid grace. The auctioneer doesn't even need to say much. Her movements do the work. She sold for 20,000 sesterces to thunderous applause. You wonder, was the applause for her or for the buyer's deep pockets? Probably the latter, yet, beneath the glitz, the cruelty is sharp. You notice a girl, barely in her teens, standing off to the side. The seller boasts of her beauty, not her skills. The bids rise slowly but steadily, and she's sold for 10,000. The laughter, the cheers, the casual chatter of buyers sipping watered wine. It all makes the scene feel grotesquely normal. You catch one senator bragging, "My household has 3 singers, 2 dancers, and a harpist. Even the emperor would envy my feasts." His companion laughs, replying, "Yes, but can they cook?" The market bursts into chuckles. You mutter under your breath. Rome's humor was as brutal as its economics. As the sun dips lower, the entertainers are led away. Their new owners already imagine the music filling marble atriums, the dances performed by torchlight, the admiration of dinner guests. To the Romans, beauty and entertainment weren't luxuries. They were currencies of influence. A dazzling performer could win allies, impress rivals, and elevate your reputation. But as you watch the last lyre player disappear into the crowd, you can't shake the thought. Every note, every graceful step, every admiring glance at beauty, behind it all was a chain, a contract, and a price in cold sesterces. In Rome, even art came with shackles. The morning bustle feels heavier today, the crowd restless, purses jingling with coin. You realize quickly that the mood has shifted. This isn't about tutors, artisans, or pretty singers anymore. Today's trade is raw muscle, measured in sweat and scars. The air smells of dust and oil as men with thick necks and scarred arms mount the block, their bodies gleaming with a strange mix of pride and resignation. The auctioneer booms with confidence. Here stands a Thracian, trained with the sword. The man flexes slightly, and the crowd leans in. Bids open at 10,000 sesterces, then rocket upward. 20,000, 40,000, 60,000. Finally, a wealthy patron secures him for 80,000 sesterces. You almost stumble at the number. This is the cost of not just a farm or villa, but a small estate. Mainstream fact: gladiators and gladiator trainees could indeed fetch astronomical sums, especially if they showed promise in the arena. The logic was brutal but clear. A winning gladiator could bring fame, draw crowds, and generate profit from bets. They were investments in blood spectacle. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some gladiators were sold almost like sports stars, complete with rumors of their past victories whispered at the auction. This one once felled 3 opponents in Gaul. An announcer might claim, regardless of truth. Think of it as ancient sports commentary, mixed with a hefty dose of marketing spin. One burly man steps forward, chains clanking around his wrists. The seller calls him a Gaul, famed for his size and ferocity. The bids roar: 50,000, 70,000, 100,000 sesterces. The hammer falls. The crowd gasps. You realize someone just paid enough to equip half a legion for one man whose value lies in how spectacularly he might die. Historians still argue whether such prices were rare outliers or a steady trend. Was every gladiator worth a fortune, or were only the most promising treated like golden geese? The sources tease but never fully clarify, leaving you dangling in uncertainty like the rest of the onlookers. And then the exotic twist. An Egyptian fighter is pushed forward, tall and sinewy, his arms painted with symbols. The auctioneer roars that he has faced lions in the arena. True or not, the bids leap. The man is sold for 60,000 sesterces. You can practically hear future crowds screaming his name, though you know the odds are he'll end up a bloodied corpse in the sand. The market atmosphere becomes rowdy, almost gladiatorial in itself. Men cheer for their favorites, boo at rivals, and slap each other's backs. It feels less like an auction and more like draft day for a deadly sport. A senator smirks to his friend. "I'll wager your new Thracian doesn't survive his first year." The friend chuckles, responding, "If he does, he'll earn me 10 times his price." The cruelty lands heavy. These men aren't purchased for their hands to plow fields or their minds to tutor children. They're bought for spectacle, for risk, for entertainment drawn from pain. Rome took human lives and turned them into betting chips. And yet, some gladiators managed to flip the script. You overhear whispers of fighters who earned enough fame to secure freedom, or even endorsements of a kind. Wealthy patrons gifting them gold, women flocking to their sides. The paradox sinks in. The same system that crushed them under chains also dangled the rare chance of celebrity. By late afternoon, the crowd thins, heavy purses emptied into sellers' hands. You watch as new owners lead away their prized acquisitions, some already speaking of future games in hushed excitement. To them, this wasn't cruelty. It was business, sport, status. To the fighters, it was survival, bought and sold for sums that could have fed whole villages. As you leave the market, the image of scarred men and shining coins sticks in your mind. Rome's appetite for blood was matched only by its willingness to pay for it. And in that math, gladiators weren't men at all. They were wages in human form, priced as high as emperors' whims would allow. The noise of the marketplace has a new flavor today, sharper, harder, edged with the tension of war. You catch sight of a column of men, their ankles chained, dust clinging to their ragged clothing. These aren't lifelong slaves born into Roman households. These are prisoners, fresh from conquest, and you can feel the shift in atmosphere. It's less auction, more liquidation sale. The auctioneer barely bothers with charm. Strong Gaulish captives, taken in last month's campaign. His voice is flat, businesslike, and the crowd reacts in kind. Bids start low, 200 sesterces, 300, 400, and close quickly. These men go in bulk, sold cheap, like sacks of grain. You realize it's because Rome isn't short on captives. After every major battle, tens of thousands were dragged here, flooding the market with human stock until prices crashed. Mainstream fact: after Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, So many prisoners flooded Rome that the value of slaves plummeted. In some places, captives were sold for less than a donkey. Imagine fighting for your homeland, then realizing you're worth less than a pack animal on the block. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some generals were accused of manipulating these sales. They'd hold back special captives, tall warriors, striking women, children of tribal leaders, and auction them separately at higher prices while dumping the rest in bulk. It's like a grotesque version of limited edition marketing. You watch a young woman no older than 20 pushed onto the stage. The auctioneer announces her as the daughter of a Gallic chieftain. The crowd perks up, bids climb, 2,000, 5,000, 9,000. She's sold for 10 times the price of her countrymen. One senator smirks, already boasting about his noble prize. Historians still argue whether Rome truly integrated such captives quickly or if they languished in brutal conditions first. Some sources suggest mass captives were herded into mines or quarries, their lives measured in months rather than years. Others imply households scooped them up cheaply, turning war prisoners into kitchen drudges. The truth may be a blend: cheap labor for farms, specialized trophies for elite buyers. The bulk sale method continues. A group of exhausted men from Judea shuffles forward, their chains rattling in unison. The seller doesn't bother listing skills. He just calls out numbers. Whole groups are sold at once, families torn apart mid-sentence as buyers split them like livestock. The hammer falls, and they're led away in separate directions, heads bowed. The cruelty feels mechanical. Unlike the spectacle of gladiators or the prestige of Greek tutors, this is conveyor belt dehumanization. A senator near you jokes, cheaper by the dozen, and the crowd laughs. You force yourself not to grimace, but not every prisoner goes cheaply. A towering man from Dacia steps onto the platform, his posture unbroken. The seller boasts about his size, his potential for hard labor, or even gladiatorial training. The bids climb higher, landing at 5,000 sesterces. He's led away under heavy guard, the buyer grinning like he's just secured a prized bull. Another layer of irony emerges. Rome's economy relied on this cycle. Conquest produced prisoners. Prisoners became slaves. Slaves fueled agriculture. Agriculture fed Rome, and the wealth funded more conquest. War wasn't just about land, it was about stocking the markets. You see it now, the gears turning in real time. Evening comes, and the square empties. The ground is littered with dust and scraps of chain, echoes of shouted numbers still hanging in the air. You realize you've witnessed one of Rome's ugliest truths. Victory abroad meant liquidation at home. And for every triumphant general riding in a parade, thousands of silent captives paid the real price. The clang of chains greets you before the shouts of bidding. Today, the crowd isn't buzzing with the thrill of rare tutors or exotic dancers. It's humming with something colder. You follow the press of bodies toward the platform and realize this auction is not for specialists or warriors, but for Rome's heavy laborers, the men and women destined for mines and farms. The auctioneer doesn't waste time with elaborate introductions. He points to a row of burly men, their backs scarred, their muscles thick from previous toil. Good for digging, hauling, enduring the sun, he barks. Bids begin at 500 sesterces and climb modestly. A farmer from the outskirts of the city secures 3 at once, paying less than a senator might spend on a single banquet. Mainstream fact: slaves assigned to mines were considered the lowest and most disposable. They were often purchased cheaply because their expected lifespan was brutally short. Gold and silver mines in Spain, for instance, devoured laborers by the thousands, with replacements constantly hauled in from fresh conquests. Quirky tidbit. Some Roman writers compared mine workers to walking dead, not as an insult, but as a grim recognition that they lived only in the shadow of death. It was common knowledge that anyone bought for mining wasn't expected to see old age. The market treated them accordingly, as expendable units of energy rather than individuals. You watch as another group is presented, this time women. The seller highlights their strength for fieldwork, praising their broad shoulders more than their faces. Prices hover around 600 sesterces each. Buyers note approvingly, discussing crop yields, soil quality, and how many hands they'll need this season. The language reduces people into tools as casually as buying plows. Historians still argue whether agricultural slaves on large estates, known as latifundia, fared slightly better than those in mines. Some evidence suggests they had longer lives and occasional rest days, while others argue their conditions were nearly as harsh, especially during harvest seasons. You lean against a column, wondering whether less brutal can even count as comfort in this economy. The auctioneer gestures to a man with a heavy frame, clearly exhausted from a previous posting. He's branded across the forehead, a permanent mark of punishment. The seller acknowledges this bluntly, calling him broken but useful. The price plummets to 200 sesterces before a buyer grudgingly takes him. It strikes you, branding didn't just mark shame, it slashed market value. Rome had built an accounting system out of scars. Next, a grim spectacle. Children, thin and weary, are led onto the platform. The seller declares them fit for future labor, though they look barely able to stand. The bids are low, 100, 150, 200 sesterces, cheaper than a donkey, but seen as investments. A buyer shrugs, remarking, "They'll grow." The words echo in your mind, hollow and chilling. The rhythm of the market here feels industrial, almost soulless. Unlike the showmanship of gladiator sales, this process is stripped to numbers and function. One senator yawns and mutters to his steward, "Just get me 30 more for the vineyard." No faces, no names, just units of labor to till endless fields of olives and grapes. Yet a strange irony surfaces. Some of these very slaves, purchased cheap and worked hard, might end up producing the wine served at elegant banquets, the olive oil traded across seas, the grain that fed Rome's hungry mobs. They were invisible cogs that kept the empire's grandeur spinning. As the day ends, you watch the buyers lead their new laborers away, shackles glinting in the fading light. You can almost hear the future groans of bodies straining in tunnels or bending in fields. Rome's prosperity glittered on the surface, but beneath it lay entire legions of the unfree. Their prices low, but their cost in suffering incalculable. The crowd gathers early today, their chatter tinged with excitement rather than routine. You weave between tunics and cloaks, realizing this isn't the usual bulk sale of farm laborers. The platform glitters with a different promise. Household slaves. The kind who'll serve wine in marble atriums, polish silverware until it gleams, and scurry at the snap of a master's fingers. The auctioneer starts with flair. A neatly groomed young man steps forward, his posture crisp. The seller announces, "Knows Latin, some Greek, trained in domestic service." The bids climb quickly, 2,500, 2,000, 2,500 sesterces. He's sold for 3,000, more than a ploughman, but far less than a doctor. You see the buyer's smug smile, a new attendant for his dinner parties. Mainstream fact, domestic slaves were among the most visible in Roman households, serving as doormen, cooks, maids, and valets. They weren't the cheapest, but their prices reflected the convenience and prestige they brought inside wealthy homes. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some Romans were so particular about household service that they bought entire teams of slaves specialized in trivial tasks, like one slave just to help. Another slave put on a master's sandals. Owning a ridiculous number of attendants was the ultimate humble brag. A young woman is next, carrying a polished jug. The seller praises her skill in managing a kitchen. Bids rise to 4,000 sesterces before she's taken by a portly merchant. You overhear him say, "At least my stew won't taste like ashes anymore." The crowd chuckles. You can't help but imagine his current cook glaring from the sidelines. Historians still argue whether household slaves had better lives compared to field laborers. Some suggest they enjoyed slightly more comfort, indoors, fed decently, less backbreaking work. Others counter that their proximity to masters meant constant scrutiny, harsher punishments, and little privacy. Either way, their prices reflected both perceived usefulness and the aura of refinement they lent to their owners. The auctioneer gestures proudly toward a boy holding a tray of cups. Quick hands trained in serving banquets. The bids rise, though not extravagantly. He's sold for 2,200. A senator whispers to his steward, "He'll look good in silver livery." You roll your eyes. Rome was obsessed with appearances down to the tiniest detail. Another offering, an older woman with calm eyes labeled as a nutrix or nurse. The seller emphasizes her experience raising children. The bids are slower but steady, finally settling at 3,500 sesterces. You realize she's valued not for glamour, but for reliability, the steady hands trusted to care for future heirs. Then comes the entertainment twist. A handsome young man, tall and neatly dressed, is marketed as a cupbearer. The seller barely disguises the undertones of beauty and companionship. The bids surge, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000. Finally, he's sold at 10,000 sesterces, nearly the price of a skilled artisan. You notice the approving nods, the knowing smirks among buyers. This isn't just about pouring wine, the variety continues. A laundress is auctioned for 1,800, a seamstress fetches 2,500, a doorman with a booming voice is sold for 3,200. Buyers joke that his shout alone could scare off burglars. Each sale feels like stocking pieces of a household machine, with humans as gears. One senator boasts to his companion, "My villa requires 50 attendants. Anything less would look provincial." His friend scoffs. "Only 50. I keep 70 just to polish the marble." The absurdity makes you stifle a laugh. Rome's upper crust measured prestige by headcount as much as by property. As twilight sets in, the platform clears. The buyers disperse, their new acquisitions trailing behind with trays, tools, and folded linens. You imagine those same slaves tonight, scrubbing kitchens, guarding doors, rocking infants, filling cups. Their market value wasn't as high as tutors or gladiators, but their presence defined Roman daily life. They were the invisible hands that made banquets glitter and villas function. Walking away, you realize something. The cost of a Roman household wasn't in its marble walls or imported mosaics. It was in the living bodies purchased to polish, cook, guard, and serve. And in the math of empire, a house didn't shine without slaves priced like cogs in its grand machine. The market feels oddly hushed today, the air heavier than usual. You slip through the crowd and realize the reason. The slaves on the platform aren't just cooks, fighters, or musicians. They're families, husbands, wives, children, lined up together but destined not to stay that way. The spectacle is quieter, but the tension cuts sharper than any sword. The auctioneer begins with little ceremony. A man and woman stand holding the hands of two small children. The seller calls them a family unit, suitable for estate labor. Bids rise sluggishly, reaching 1,200 sesterces for all four. A buyer nods, satisfied with the bulk purchase. But then, to your horror, he gestures for the children to be separated, sending them toward another buyer. The parents' faces crumple. The crowd barely blinks. Mainstream. Fact: Roman law recognized no protection for keeping slave families intact. Children could be sold away at any time, and marriages between slaves had no legal standing. They called it contubernium, a kind of informal partnership, but to Rome, it was never binding. And the quirky tidbit? Some masters, oddly sentimental, allowed slaves to marry under ceremony-like arrangements, even throwing modest feasts. But everyone understood the arrangement was fragile as glass, breakable with a single sale at the market. A young boy is led onto the platform next. The seller shouts, "Strong arms for his age, ready for training." The bids tick upward, 500, 700, 900, before the hammer drops. His mother, still in line, reaches desperately toward him as he's dragged away. The crowd watches silently, unmoved. The economics of Rome had no space for sentiment. Historians still argue whether the majority of Roman slaves lived in fractured households or whether some families were allowed relative stability, especially on larger estates. Evidence exists of multi-generational slave households, but just as many stories tell of constant separation. The debate lingers, but the truth you're witnessing here feels brutally one-sided. The next lot. An elderly man. Grey hair, thin, his back stooped. The seller calls him a useful caretaker and tries to spin him as reliable for supervising younger slaves. The bids are reluctant, finally settling at 300 sesterces. He shuffles off, his family long gone, his worth whittled down by age. You sense he'll end his days in someone's garden, more ornament than laborer. Nearby, two young siblings cling to one another. A buyer wins them for 400 sesterces each, muttering that they'll be trained for housework. You overhear another man whisper, "Better to buy them young, they'll learn obedience quicker." You feel your stomach twist. In Rome, even childhood was commodified, and yet a cruel irony shines through. Some buyers actually preferred to buy family units, not out of compassion, but efficiency. Families tended to work harder together, less likely to run away when their loved ones were nearby. The bonds that Rome tore apart could also be twisted into tools of control. The auctioneer presents a woman with an infant in her arms. He assures buyers the child comes free with the mother. A few chuckle. The bids crawl forward until she's sold for 800 sesterces. You realize the baby wasn't valued as a person, but as extra baggage, an appendage that cost nothing but might grow into labor someday. As dusk falls, the market disperses, quieter than usual. The buyers lead their new acquisitions away, children stumbling beside strangers, parents glancing back until they vanish into the throng. The torchlight flickers across faces hardened into resignation. Walking away, you realize that for Rome, family was both invisible and invaluable. Invisible because the law didn't recognize it. Invaluable because those same bonds were exploited, broken, or sold as part of the empire's machinery. In the end, a family's worth here wasn't love. It was coin, counted coldly in sesterces. The market today hums with a different energy, not the heavy gloom of broken families, nor the spectacle of gladiators, but the quiet calculation of seasoned traders. You step closer to the platform and notice something unusual. Many of the slaves aren't freshly captured or young. They're older, scarred, and sometimes branded. This isn't the first time they've stood on a block. These are recycled lives, sold and resold as circumstances changed. The auctioneer begins with a weary-looking man, his back stooped but still strong enough to carry loads. Previously a vineyard worker, he declares, knows the rhythm of the harvest. The bids rise slowly, 400, 500, 600 sesterces. A farmer takes him, clearly more interested in experience than novelty. You realize these used slaves, if you can stomach the phrase, had histories that shaped their market value. Mainstream fact, second-hand sales were common in Rome. A slave might pass through multiple households, each sale adjusting their price depending on age, skills, or reputation. Slaves weren't fixed assets, they were depreciating ones, bought and sold like draft animals or worn tools. Here's the quirky tidbit: sellers often exaggerated or downplayed details the way a modern used car dealer might.
Only lightly whipped, still good for service.
One joke supposedly ran. In fact, Roman law required sellers to declare defects, illness, escape attempts, criminal behavior, or risk legal disputes. Imagine a marketplace where people came with disclaimers like, "Warning, tends to steal figs." On the block now, a woman with tired eyes but graceful posture. The seller announces she's a skilled weaver, but admits she's attempted escape once. The bids stall at 350 sesterces before a stern-looking buyer agrees. You hear him mutter, "Chains will fix that." The market has reduced her entire rebellion to a discount tag. Historians still argue how often slaves managed to negotiate better conditions by being sold to new masters. Some accounts hint at opportunities for improvement. An urban household might feel lighter than a brutal farm. Others suggest sales rarely changed fate, just swapped one cage for another. The auctioneer presents a young man with whip scars across his back. Strong body but rebellious, the seller warns. The price plummets, barely reaching 200 sesterces. A buyer smirks, saying he'll break him properly. You feel the irony. Punishment, scars both punished the body and slashed the resale value. But sometimes resale worked in the other direction. A boy trained in household service is presented. Previously in a senator's villa, the seller crows. Knows etiquette, pours wine without spilling. The bids climb higher than expected. 2,000, 2,500, 3,000. The connection to a noble household boosted his reputation. As though he carried the sparkle of elite polish with him, the darker side creeps in again. An elderly woman steps forward, trembling slightly. The auctioneer admits she's past her prime. No one bids at first. Finally, someone offers 100 sesterces. The buyer shrugs, remarking she'll make a decent nurse for his grandchildren. You realize with a shiver that age didn't earn respect here. It erased value. Nearby, you overhear two men bargaining privately. One offers to sell his troublesome cook to another for half price. They haggle over details. She seasons too heavily, but she bakes bread well. It feels less like conversation about a person and more like swapping recipes. By sunset, the platform clears. The scarred, branded, and weary have been redistributed, shuffled into new households, estates, or mines. For some, the change might mean marginally better conditions. For others, worse. The market didn't care. It only measured coin against flesh, tallying up the worth of recycled lives. As you drift away, you think of the irony. Rome prided itself on monuments built to last centuries, but the people who built them were treated like tools to be replaced, bought, or resold until they broke. In this economy, permanence belonged to stone, not to skin. The market doesn't look different this morning. Same wooden platform, same clamor of buyers and sellers, but your ears soon catch the shift. Instead of booming confidence, the auctioneer speaks with a sly edge. He stretches numbers, flatters floors, and occasionally dodges questions. You realize you've stepped into the underbelly of the trade, the tricks, scams, and risks that came with buying human lives. The first example unfolds quickly. A man is paraded forward, looking sturdy enough. The seller brags of his strength, claiming he's never sick a day in his life. But someone in the crowd shouts back, "Then why the limp?" Laughter ripples. The bids drop, and the buyer storms off. The seller's face reddens. You've just witnessed the Roman version of false advertising. Mainstream fact. Roman law actually had provisions for this. Sellers were required to disclose certain defects, like chronic illness, history of theft, or attempts to escape. If they failed, buyers could return the slave for a refund, like a grim version of a warranty policy. And here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes sellers tried to game this rule by using vague language. One might say, healthy enough for light duties, which legally covered them if the slave collapsed during heavy labor. It was the ancient world's fine print. The next lot is a young woman described as excellent for household service. But when a sharp-eyed buyer presses, the seller admits she's been branded for theft. The crowd hisses and the price sinks fast. She's sold for 300 sesterces, far below her potential value. You realize marks weren't just physical pain, they were permanent price tags, warnings burned into skin. Historians still argue whether the disclosure laws were strictly enforced or mostly ignored in practice. Some evidence suggests frequent lawsuits over fraudulent sales, while other records imply many buyers simply accepted the risks. After all, who would spend months in court when you could just buy another person tomorrow? One seller tries a trickier con. He brings forward a boy, clearly underfed, but oils his skin to make him look healthier. The crowd murmurs approval until someone wipes a hand across the boy's arm, revealing dirt beneath the sheen. The laughter is cruel, but the bids still land at 700 sesterces. You realize appearances could be staged, but not always convincingly. Another ploy appears in the form of auction drama. A seller plants a shill bidder in the crowd, inflating the price of a girl until another buyer panics and overpays. You watch the smirk between them, coins exchanged later in private. The market wasn't just cruel, it was rigged. Then there's the gamble of loyalty. A tall man is auctioned as obedient and hard-working, but whispers circulate that he once attacked a master in rage. The bids freeze. Finally, a risk-taker offers 500 sesterces, shrugging, a chain will cure his temper. The risk wasn't just financial, it could mean blood in the night. Yet sometimes the gamble paid off. A woman sold cheaply because she was slow in one household, flourished in another, eventually managing an entire kitchen. Stories like hers floated through Rome, half legend, half hope, reminding buyers that the market's labels weren't always accurate. As the day winds down, you see buyers counting coins nervously, muttering about whether they've been cheated. Sellers pack up, some gloating, others sour. The torches sputter as the last trades are made. Walking away, you realize the truth. In a system where people were treated as products, the same forces of fraud, risk, and buyer's remorse applied. Rome's slave market wasn't just cruel, it was a casino of flesh, where every bid came with a chance of disappointment, danger, or regret. The morning begins with a chill, but the market blazes with heat of another kind, imperial presence. You glance around and notice buyers dressed more richly than usual, their retinues trailing behind. These aren't modest farmers or middling merchants. These are men and women with coin purses fat enough to sway politics. And the slaves on offer today? They're not ordinary field hands. They're luxury goods meant to decorate villas and impress senators. The auctioneer plays his part, voice booming with exaggerated grandeur. He presents a young boy with delicate features, his hair oiled, his skin carefully cleaned. A perfect page for your banquets, he announces. The bids rise with startling speed, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000 sesterces. Finally, he's claimed for 12,000 by a senator's aide, who whispers smugly, "The mistress will be pleased." Mainstream fact: wealthy Romans weren't content with mere functionality. They craved slaves who added to their prestige pages, secretaries, cupbearers, or personal bodyguards. Owning such attendants wasn't about necessity. It was about status, an unspoken competition in marble atriums across Rome. And the quirky tidbit: some nobles gave their household slaves matching uniforms in bright colors, parading them like walking ornaments during processions. Imagine a small army of identically dressed attendants, more fashion accessory than human. The next lot is a Greek youth, praised as handsome, literate, and skilled in music. The bids spiral higher. 15,000, 18,000, 20,000 sesterces. He's purchased by a matron with a glint of triumph in her eye. You hear someone mutter, "He'll cost more in jewelry than his price in coin." You realize beauty was currency in itself, often commanding absurd sums. Historians still argue how much appearance versus skill determined prices in elite circles. Some accounts suggest beauty consistently trumped utility, while others argue specialized knowledge, like rhetoric or medicine, could outbid mere looks. The truth may be that the Roman elite simply wanted both and had the wealth to indulge every whim. Another example unfolds: a tall Nubian man with imposing muscles, advertised as a personal bodyguard. The crowd buzzes. The bids surge, reaching 25,000 sesterces before a governor secures him. You imagine the man stationed at a villa entrance, a living deterrent to thieves or rivals. Prestige wrapped itself not just in silk, but in muscle. Then comes the exotic. A seller introduces a woman from far across the empire, speaking a language no one understands. The auctioneer highlights her rare origins, practically marketing her as a collectible. The bids rise not for her skills, but for the novelty of owning someone from beyond the borders. She's sold for 10,000, her fate sealed by curiosity. The whispers among buyers reveal the absurdity of it all. One boasts of having 50 slaves just to carry torches at parties. Another claims his bathhouse requires 20 attendants, though he never bathes alone. The conversation feels like an arms race, except the weapons are people. As dusk nears, the final lot arrives. A group of slaves trained in acting and singing, presented as an ensemble. The price skyrockets, ending at 40,000 sesterces. The buyer grins, imagining his private theatre troupe performing exclusively for him. You can't help but think, Rome's rich didn't just consume labor, they consumed lives as entertainment. Walking away, you feel the sharp edge of contrast.
In the same empire where field workers sold for a few hundred sesterces, the elite spent fortunes on slaves they treated as living ornaments.
The market wasn't just economics, it was theater, where the wealthy flaunted their power by purchasing human extravagance. You arrive at the market under a blazing noon sun, and something feels different. The slaves being presented aren't grouped by age, skill, or beauty. Instead, the auctioneer shouts about where they come from: Gaul, Thrace, Syria, Egypt. Geography itself has become the selling point. You realize you're watching Rome's obsession with origins, where stereotypes could inflate or slash a price faster than any scar. The first man is introduced as a Thracian. The seller emphasizes his strength, adding with a wink, perfect gladiator material. The crowd leans forward, bids rising fast, 2,000, 3,000, 4,500 sesterces. He's claimed at 5,000, his reputation carried not by his muscles alone, but by the Thracian label, associated with fierce warriors. Mainstream fact: Romans often valued slaves differently depending on their ethnic background. Thracians, Germans, and Gauls were seen as physically powerful, ideal for mines or arenas. Greeks, by contrast, were prized for intellect, teaching, and culture. Syrians and Egyptians were often associated with specialized crafts or exotic allure. And the quirky tidbit: some Romans believed Cappadocians made excellent cooks but terrible fighters, while Syrians were thought to be clever but deceitful. These sweeping generalizations turned entire peoples into caricatures, like ancient Yelp reviews for human beings. Next, a Greek youth is paraded out. The auctioneer barely needs to describe him, just saying, "From Athens" is enough. The bids leap upward, reaching 10,000 sesterces before settling. You hear a buyer whisper proudly, "Nothing elevates a household like a Greek tutor." It's a stereotype, turned into a sales pitch. Historians still argue whether these ethnic stereotypes were rooted in reality or simply lazy generalizations, exploited by sellers. Some suggest certain skills clustered by region. Greeks did produce many educated captives, but others argue it was marketing smoke and mirrors. After all, not every Thracian wanted to fight, nor every Greek to quote poetry. The next lot is a woman from Syria, described as beautiful, skilled in weaving, exotic. The word exotic lingers like perfume in the crowd. The bids climb, 3,000, 5,000, 7,000. She's bought by a wealthy merchant, no doubt imagining the status her foreignness alone will project in his home. You sense her silence, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond Rome. Then comes a Germanic boy, tall for his age, blonde hair catching the light. The auctioneer calls him a strong prospect for heavy work. The bids stay modest, around 1,000 sesterces, before he's sold. Unlike Greeks or Syrians, his value lies in muscle, not refinement. His heritage dictates his destiny. The strangest case appears next, an Egyptian scribe carrying a reed pen. The seller boasts of his knowledge of hieroglyphs and temple records. The bids are cautious, eventually landing at 8,000. You overhear one Roman mutter, "Why pay for scribbles I can't even read?" Prestige, yes. Practicality, maybe not. As the market winds down, the divisions become clear. Origin wasn't just background, it was branding, stamped onto bodies like invisible labels. Some fetched fortunes, others barely coins, based on nothing more than birthplace and stereotype. Walking away, you feel the dissonance. Rome prided itself on ruling a diverse empire, yet that diversity was flattened into caricatures for sale. To the buyers, Gauls were brawn, Greeks were brains, Syrians were beauty, and everyone else was slotted somewhere in between. It wasn't truth, but in the market, it was price. The sun hasn't even burned off the morning mist when you hear the change in tone. The market feels urgent, louder, more frantic. Sellers shout prices with unusual aggression, and buyers bargain harder than ever. You overhear whispers. Prices are climbing. Too many buyers, not enough bodies. You realize you're walking into one of those moments when the economy of slavery itself shifts under Rome's feet. The auctioneer's first lot is a group of farmhands, normally steady sellers at modest prices. But today, the bids leap higher than usual, 800, 1,200, 1,600 sesterces. A farmer grimaces as he pays well above what he might have last year. You sense the strain, demand outpacing supply. Mainstream fact, the cost of slaves in Rome was never fixed. Wars, plagues, and harvests all twisted the market. After major conquests, the influx of captives flooded auctions, dropping prices.
But in times of peace or shortage, prices soared,
making laborers harder for smaller farmers to afford. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some buyers timed their purchases like bargain hunters at a modern sale, waiting for victorious generals to return and dump thousands of captives on the market. Imagine lining up not for shoes, but for discounted human lives. Today, though, no conquest has just ended. Instead, supply is thin. The auctioneer presents a strong-looking man from the provinces. The bids spiral to 3,000 sesterces, far higher than his apparent skill warrants. A frustrated buyer mutters, "At this rate, it's cheaper to hire free men." That irony wasn't lost on Rome. The very abundance of slaves sometimes suppressed free labor wages. Yet in shortages, free workers could become more economical. Historians still argue about just how volatile slave prices were across centuries.
Some evidence suggests a fairly stable market in the long run, while other records show wild fluctuations tied to wars like the conquest of Gaul or disasters like plagues.
The debate remains: steady economics or roller coaster chaos? The next lot is a young girl advertised as a domestic servant. Her price climbs past 2,500 sesterces, then 3,500, until she's taken for 4,000. The buyer shakes his head afterward, muttering that he's just paid the cost of a small estate for a single attendant. You realize markets weren't just about function, they were about prestige bidding wars too. Another sign of change appears with older slaves. Normally cheap, they suddenly command higher prices, 500 or 600 sesterces, because desperate buyers are willing to take anyone capable of light labor. Even worn tools have gained value when supply runs low. And then comes the most bizarre twist. A man who clearly looks frail and sickly is still bid on fiercely. Why? Because he's trained in account keeping. His value isn't in his body but his mind, and buyers argue over him like investors fighting over stocks. He sells for 10,000 sesterces, leaving the crowd buzzing. The chatter around you grows philosophical. One man mutters that Rome's empire depends too much on conquest to fuel this market. Another argues that without wars, prices will strangle smaller landowners. A third jokes, pray for victory, or we'll all go broke. The laughter is sharp, but uneasy. As evening falls, you see the exhaustion in buyers' faces, the strain of overpaying. Slaves shuffle away, some new to bondage, others just caught in the swing of Rome's economics. And you're left thinking, the market wasn't just a stage of cruelty. It was a mirror of the empire itself. Expansion brought cheap flesh, peace brought scarcity, and every price tag revealed the empire's hunger. The day begins with the scent of dust and roasted grain drifting through the marketplace. Today, you notice something unusual. Buyers are taking notes, scribbling on wax tablets, comparing numbers obsessively. It's less about spectacle or novelty. Today's focus is pure calculation, economics distilled to flesh and coin. You realize you've stumbled into what Romans might have called mercatus pecuniarius humanus, the human money market. The auctioneer steps forward with a group of male slaves, all young and strong. "Good for vineyards, roads, construction," he shouts. The bids begin predictably, but you notice a subtle change. Buyers are factoring in projected productivity, lifespan, and even potential illness. One murmurs to his companion, "If he lasts 5 years, he pays for himself tenfold." You blink. You're seeing cost-benefit analysis applied to humans, not cattle or tools. Mainstream fact: Roman buyers often calculated a slave's worth in terms of projected labor output. Farmers and estate owners would estimate how many bushels of grain or amphorae of oil a worker could produce over time, adjusting bids accordingly. Efficiency had a cold numerical logic. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some buyers even applied rudimentary insurance tactics. If a purchased slave was prone to rebellion or sickness, they might buy 2 in anticipation that one would survive the first year. You can almost hear modern accountants nodding at this strategy, though the morality feels absurdly off-kilter. A young woman appears, skilled in weaving and cooking. The auctioneer claims she can manage 3 assistants simultaneously. Bids climb, 4,500, 2,000, 2,500 sesterces. She's purchased by a matron who immediately whispers instructions for household management. You realize the moment she's sold, her life becomes tightly regimented. Each movement monetized. Historians still argue whether such efficiency-focused pricing truly reflected productivity or was an overcompensation for fear of rebellion. Some suggest buyers overpaid for the illusion of reliability, while others note that many slaves were actually very productive when motivated by small incentives or personal bonds. Nearby, a burly Gaulish man is auctioned. The seller boasts of his endurance in the sun and strength for lifting heavy stones. Bids escalate to 5,000 sesterces. One buyer quips, if he survives a Roman summer, he'll repay me in sweat alone. The humor is dry, but the message is clear. Human effort is being counted in numbers, not dignity. The market continues with a Greek tutor, an older nurse, and a young Nubian athlete. Each sale is accompanied by whispered calculations. She'll save me a steward's salary. He'll build the wall in half the time. This one might win me fame in the arena. Every human being is measured for utility as much as appearance or origin. A particularly striking case catches your eye. A boy is sold cheaply at 700 sesterces, apparently unremarkable. But an observant buyer notices he's literate, trained in both Latin and Greek. The man whispers, "Hidden value," and purchases him immediately. You realize that even the market recognized the invisible currency of knowledge, though it remains subject to the whims of perception. By sunset, the frenzy dies down. Buyers tally their investments, sellers pocket coins, and slaves are led off in various directions, some aware of their worth, others ignorant. You step back, noting the uncomfortable truth. In Rome, human labor was assessed and quantified, transformed into financial projections. Flesh and skill were currency, and every coin paid carried a silent calculation of survival, obedience, and productivity. The day begins with an almost festive air, yet beneath the laughter and banter, the undertone is unmistakably calculated. You push through the crowd and notice something strange. Some buyers aren't even looking at the slave's skills or beauty. They're checking physical health obsessively, lifting arms, tapping backs, sniffing breath. This is a market obsessed with durability. The auctioneer calls forward a tall, muscular man. Excellent for labor, no known illness, he boasts. A potential buyer pinches the man's arm, checks his teeth, and even taps his chest. Bids climb steadily. Or 500, 2,000, 2,500 sesterces. You notice murmurs among the crowd. He's healthy, but can he work under sun? He looks fit, but how long before exhaustion? Durability, not just skill, drives value. Mainstream fact. Romans were acutely aware of the health of their slaves. Chronic illness, poor teeth, or a weak constitution reduced resale value drastically. Many buyers inspected slaves as rigorously as a modern mechanic checks a used engine. Quirky tidbit. Some buyers carried small weights or stones to test a slave's strength on the spot, while others would have them run a short distance to measure endurance. You can almost hear a whisper. Step aside, treadmill. Rome has humans for quality testing. Next, a young woman appears, praised for her skill in cooking and weaving. The auctioneer makes a point of highlighting her strong back and steady hands. The bids ascend, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 sesterces, before a wealthy matron secures her. You see the subtle acknowledgement. Health and reliability often mattered more than elegance in long-term household service. Historians still argue whether Roman buyers exaggerated the health, check process for show, or actually relied on it for practical assessment. Some sources indicate rituals of examination were performative, meant to impress other buyers, while others suggest that these inspections genuinely affected survival and utility. A curious scene unfolds next.
A boy, wiry but quick, is tested by lifting a small stone.
The crowd murmurs approval. Someone comments, "Small but tenacious, he'll survive anything." The bids leap accordingly. You notice that even slight physical advantages could double or triple a price, reinforcing the empire's obsession with tangible measurement. The market then turns to a group of older men and women previously undervalued. Their sturdy constitutions are highlighted. Good for orchards, no history of illness, the auctioneer notes. Bids are modest but higher than expected, proof that experience and health together can elevate worth. Even the quirks of Roman economics emerge. Some buyers prefer slightly older slaves, reasoning they are tested by life and less likely to rebel. You overhear a man say, "Better a few grey hairs than a dozen surprises." It's a strange comfort logic, using age as a security feature. By late afternoon, you watch as the healthy, durable, and tested slaves are led away. Prices tallied and expectations set. The marketplace is a theater of flesh and resilience, where survival, strength, and steady hands became currency as much as coin. You can't help but feel the chilling precision. Rome didn't just buy humans, it bought potential, endurance, and measurable reliability, transforming life into a ledger of investment. The sun leans low over the market, casting long shadows across dust and chain. Today, the crowd moves with a mix of urgency and calculation. You notice the subtle nods and whispered exchanges that reveal an invisible network of speculation. It's a reminder, the Roman slave market wasn't just about present needs. It was about future gain, about investment strategy. A robust Gaulish man steps forward. The auctioneer hails him as perfect for construction or guarding livestock. But buyers are whispering among themselves, eyeing him for a different reason. Rumor has it he's survived previous harsh masters without complaint. The price climbs 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 sesterces before a wealthy merchant secures him. The logic is clear. Proven resilience increases future profitability. Mainstream fact, repeat sales of slaves were common. Experienced buyers knew the advantage of a slave who had survived prior labor, punishments, or escapes. Reputation, sometimes earned, sometimes exaggerated, added to market value. Quirky tidbit. Rumors about a slave's past often enhanced prices, even if unverifiable. One seller might boast he once lifted an entire cart by himself, and the crowd would bid as if it were gospel.
The line between fact and marketing in ancient Rome was astonishingly thin. Next comes a young woman skilled in cooking and childcare. The seller praises her previous masters, her health, and her compliance. Bids tick upward, 1,200, 1,500, 1,800 sesterces before a matron claims her. You notice the pattern. Prior experience and perceived obedience are weighed as carefully as skill or beauty. Historians still argue how much truth buyers placed in such stories. Were they savvy investors analyzing performance or gullible participants swayed by theatrics? Probably a mixture, and the results were unpredictable. The auctioneer presents a group of teenage boys known as helpers for workshops. Their value is calculated by age, size, and prior skills. The bids climb steadily, 700, 1,000, up to 200 sesterces. One buyer comments, if they last 2 years, it'll cover the purchase of a new tool. The casual economic comparison makes your stomach twist. Then an older man appears, with a history of rebellion whispered behind the crowd. The auctioneer admits it, but emphasizes his knowledge of carpentry. Surprisingly, he sells for 900 sesterces. Experience and utility can outweigh even dangerous reputations, showing Rome's pragmatic cruelty. A Greek scribe is next, quietly carrying scrolls. The seller highlights literacy, numeracy, and knowledge of Roman law. Bids skyrocket, 8,000, 9,500, 10,000 sesterces. You realize that skills not only promised efficiency, but also status. Owning a literate slave signaled sophistication. The crowd's energy shifts toward whispers about which slaves will prove profitable, which will rebel, and which will falter. In this market, gossip and reputation are currencies alongside sesterces. You watch buyers nod subtly, mentally calculating potential returns, risk, and the chance of having to replace the investment entirely. As the sun sets, the market empties slowly. Slaves are led away, some seasoned, some fresh from past auctions, all measured for utility, endurance, and skill. You leave with the realization that Rome's economy was a living calculation, human lives reduced to risk assessment and speculation. Even as coins changed hands, the market had already priced in obedience, labor output, and survival odds, a brutal ledger etched in flesh. The morning fog rolls over the market, carrying a sense of anticipation. Today, the crowd is smaller but more focused. You notice the way buyers lean forward, murmuring quietly, pens scratching on wax tablets. They aren't merely shopping, they're strategizing, calculating future value. The auction today is about specialization, the kind that transforms ordinary labor into coveted expertise. The first lot is a man advertised as a stonemason. The seller enumerates every skill: knowledge of limestone, ability to shape marble, experience in aqueduct construction. The bid soar, 3,000, 4,500, 6,000 sesterces. A wealthy builder claims him, clearly expecting that his expertise will yield both profit and prestige. You realize this market rewards craft as much as muscle. Mainstream fact: skilled slaves, artisans, teachers, scribes, and performers regularly commanded prices far above unskilled laborers. Expertise was scarce and therefore valuable, turning knowledge into coin. Quirky tidbit: some Roman buyers even speculated on artistic potential, paying premiums for slaves who could, theoretically, produce works comparable to famous Greek masters. You can almost imagine someone in a toga whispering, "This boy might carve a statue to rival Phidias." Ambition met commerce in the oddest ways. Next, a young woman steps forward, praised for embroidery and textile work. The bids rise to 4,000 sesterces before a wealthy matron claims her. You notice the fascination with technique, skill that could produce garments not merely for use, but for display and social signaling. Owning her meant not just labor, but prestige. Historians still argue how much these specialized slaves shaped Roman culture versus merely serving utility. Some contend their influence was immense, passing knowledge and craft into elite households. Others argue that while talented, their work was strictly functional, prized for appearance rather than innovation. Nearby, a boy trained in bookkeeping is presented. The seller emphasizes literacy and familiarity with accounts. Bids climb aggressively, 7,000, 8,500, 10,000 sesterces, before a senator's aide secures him. You realize he's considered a financial asset, a tool to preserve and multiply wealth rather than physical labor. Then comes a rare spectacle:
a singer from Alexandria, his voice praised as capable of stirring the soul. The crowd gasps. And bids spiral. 12,000, 15,000, 18,000 sesterces, finally sold to a patrician who apparently wants exclusive entertainment in his private villa. The market, you notice, thrives not just on labor, but on pleasure. The auctioneer gestures to a seasoned cook next. The seller praises creativity, speed, and loyalty. The bids ascend modestly to 3,500 sesterces. You overhear a buyer joke, "Better she feeds me well than I feed her gold." Humor hides the same cold calculation. Food becomes profit when managed efficiently. A craftsman in bronze work is sold next. His price is 6,000 sesterces, a reflection of scarcity and skill. Nearby, buyers murmur about the value of maintaining a skilled household workshop. In Rome, specialized labor was currency, often more valuable than brute strength. By afternoon, the market slows. You watch buyers count coins with satisfaction, each acquisition a potential asset. Slaves leave, some to perform mundane labor, others to practice craft, entertain, or manage wealth. The economy of knowledge and talent, woven into flesh and instruction, proves as vital as the muscles used for fields or construction. Walking away. The lesson settles in. In Rome, human worth wasn't merely physical, it was functional, intellectual, and even aesthetic. Skill, like coin, could command extraordinary value, turning a single life into a long-term investment with tangible returns. The morning is golden and still, carrying the hum of a market settling into rhythm. Today, you notice buyers murmuring over wax tablets, comparing notes, and making strategic calculations. The auctioneer steps up, but his voice is almost secondary. This crowd is sophisticated, invested, and ready to weigh not just labor, but potential, temperament, and projected obedience. The first lot is a man described as a soldier turned laborer. The seller emphasizes his discipline, strength, and ability to follow orders under pressure. Bids rise quickly, 3,000, 4,500, 5,500 sesterces, before a wealthy landowner claims him. You realize the market prizes behavior as much as muscle. Obedience itself becomes a currency. Mainstream fact: Roman buyers carefully assessed the temperament of slaves, seeking those who were reliable or docile. A reputation for obedience could significantly increase a slave's market value, while signs of rebellion or resistance would depress it. Quirky tidbit. Some sellers would stage minor tests of obedience, ordering a slave to perform arbitrary tasks in public to impress buyers. If the slave complied flawlessly, the price could skyrocket. You can almost see them thinking, yes, this one will fetch higher sesterces under control. Next, a young woman steps forward, praised for both domestic skill and charm. She bows slightly, her hands steady, her voice polite. The bids climb to 3,000, then 4,000 sesterces before a matron purchases her. You notice the subtle factors influencing price, demeanor, politeness, and perceived intelligence. Social grace is treated as property. Historians still argue how accurately temperament assessments predicted long-term behavior. Some evidence suggests that prior treatment and training, rather than innate disposition, largely dictated obedience. Others contend that buyers exaggerated the effectiveness of these tests to justify high bids. Nearby, a group of men trained in construction are presented. One stands slightly apart, known for defiance in a prior household. The seller downplays the history, calling him spirited. The bidding is cautious, finally settling at 2,000 sesterces. You realize the market constantly balanced risk and reward. Then comes a Greek musician, praised for skill on the lyre and knowledge of Greek melodies. Bids rise to 12,000 sesterces before he's purchased. Talent, entertainment, and perceived refinement now drive the market. You notice whispers among buyers comparing previous owners' assessments, almost like consulting Yelp reviews. Another case appears. A woman labeled as a nurse and caretaker. Her previous charges survived under her watch. Bids reach 4,500 sesterces. You realize reliability over time can outweigh youth or beauty. Experience here is measured monetarily, rewarded in sesterces, and recognized in whispers. The auctioneer presents an unusual lot, a young man described as clever with numbers and contracts. He's bid on aggressively. 8,900 sesterces, reflecting the rising value of mental labor over brute strength. Rome is clearly willing to pay for intelligence, not just muscle. By late afternoon, the market slows, the crowd thinning. Slaves leave in pairs and small groups, their value judged in obedience, temperament, skill, and prior performance. Each acquisition is a calculated investment, the price reflecting not just work done, but behavior, promise, and potential. As you step back, you understand a subtle truth. In Rome, human lives were evaluated like portfolios. Muscles, skill, temperament, and intelligence were all commodities, priced according to the projected return. Every bid, every whisper, every gesture influenced the invisible ledger of profit. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows over the market, and you feel a strange hush. Today, buyers focus on specialized rarity, slaves who possess unusual skills, exotic origins, or unique appearances. It's not the routine labor or domestic service auction. This is a stage for exceptional human capital, where novelty, rarity, and flair drive prices sky high. A tall, muscular Nubian man steps forward, his skin gleaming, his bearing noble. The auctioneer announces, "Trained in dance and combat, perfect for display and protection." The crowd murmurs. Bids climb rapidly, 8,000, 12,000, 15,000 sesterces. A senator secures him with a grin. You notice the pattern. The combination of exotic origin and dual skill set inflates value exponentially. Mainstream fact. Romans prized rare or exotic slaves for both functional and social purposes. African, Egyptian, and Eastern Mediterranean slaves often commanded higher prices because of perceived physicality, aesthetic appeal, or unusual talents. Quirky tidbit. Some buyers collected slaves almost like living art, keeping them solely for appearances at banquets or parades. Imagine an entire household where a slave's primary duty is standing still and looking impressive. Next, a young Greek girl appears, noted for her musical abilities and fluency in several dialects. Bids escalate dramatically, 10,000, 12,500, 15,000, before she's purchased by a wealthy matron who seems eager to showcase both her education and charm. You realize culture, like beauty, becomes currency when scarcity and status collide. Historians still argue whether the fascination with exotic slaves was primarily aesthetic or tied to perceived magical or cultural power. Some sources suggest genuine admiration for skill or lineage. Others argue it was purely social signaling, a way to show dominance and sophistication. Nearby, a boy from Thrace, muscled and fierce, is advertised as a potential gladiator. Bids soar to 20,000 sesterces, reflecting both the anticipated entertainment value and the prestige of owning someone destined for the arena. You feel the absurd tension, life reduced to spectacle and investment at once. Then comes an unusual sale, a woman described as multilingual, skilled in herbal remedies and knowledgeable in household management. The auctioneer emphasizes her versatility. Bids rise 5,000, 7,500, 9,000 before she's secured. You notice that versatility often outperforms single-skill specialization. Rome rewards adaptability when calculating potential return. A particularly striking example follows, a young man with a rare talent for mathematics and engineering. The seller boasts that he can supervise construction projects and manage estate accounts simultaneously. Bids climb 12,000, 15,000, 18,000 sesterces before a wealthy landowner claims him. Intellectual skill, rare in the market, becomes the ultimate luxury. By sunset, the crowd thins, leaving whispers of who purchased the most extraordinary slaves and at what cost. You watch as people tally investments, exchange small rumors, and strategize for future acquisitions. You realize that in Rome, rarity and skill were currencies as potent as wealth itself. Walking away, you understand that the market had evolved from basic labor to complex valuation, physical ability, temperament, cultural refinement, rarity, and skill all intersected to create an elaborate, chilling economy. The human body became ledger, the mind a commodity, and the exotic a spectacle. Twilight settles over the marketplace, the torches flickering and casting dancing shadows across the dusty ground. Today feels quieter, as if the chaos of previous days has finally exhausted itself. You notice that the remaining buyers speak in hushed tones, calculating risks and whispering promises. The focus has shifted entirely from spectacle to strategy, the final round of investments before nightfall. The first lot is a seasoned housekeeper, older but experienced. The auctioneer praises her efficiency, knowledge of household management, and ability to train younger slaves. Bids begin modestly, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 sesterces, but rise steadily as multiple matrons compete. You sense that experience, the invisible currency accumulated over decades, has its own weight. Mainstream fact. Older. Skilled slaves often retained value because their knowledge could train others, manage households, or maintain continuity in estates. They were seen as stabilizing assets. Quirky tidbit. Some wealthy Romans actually preferred older slaves for teaching manners or etiquette to younger attendants. Imagine a frail but wise tutor molding a household of noisy youths. Age, once a disadvantage, becomes leverage. Next, a young man trained in rhetoric is introduced. His gestures are precise, voice measured, confident. Bids leap 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 sesterces before a senator claims him. You notice that intellectual skill was treated as both a utility and a status symbol. Owning someone who could impress guests elevated social standing as much as function. Historians still argue whether intellectual slaves truly wielded influence or were primarily ornamental. Some evidence points to real administrative and pedagogical impact, while other accounts suggest that their primary value was performative, enhancing the prestige of their masters. Nearby, a small group of children is offered together. The seller emphasizes their potential labor and ability to learn household tasks quickly. Bids rise cautiously, 500, 700, 900 sesterces, until a buyer secures them for a modest sum. You notice the brutal calculation. Youth promises long-term service, but also carries risk of rebellion or illness. Then a rare case. A woman of striking beauty and musical talent, advertised as a jewel for your villa. The bids climb rapidly, 5,000, 7,500, 10,000 sesterces, before a wealthy patrician claims her. You notice the pattern. Aesthetic appeal combined with skill drives prices exponentially, creating a market where human worth is measured in combined attributes. A Greek artisan is presented next, capable of metalwork and sculpting. Bids reach 15,000 sesterces before he's claimed. You realize that specialized craft, like intellectual skill or exotic origin, consistently commands extraordinary premiums. Rome's elite doesn't just consume labor, they invest in prestige, talent, and versatility. By nightfall, the final slaves are led away. The market empties, buyers counting coins, sellers satisfied or disappointed. You linger, absorbing the scale of the day. Muscles, skill, obedience. Temperament, age, rarity, intelligence. Beauty, all transformed into monetary value, weighed, bid upon, and exchanged like commodities. Walking away, the lesson is clear and chilling. Rome's economy was not merely about trade. It was about converting human potential into numbers, measuring life itself in sesterces. You feel the weight of the empire's logic, where the line between flesh and currency is not just blurred, but erased. Every sale, every whispered calculation, and every strategic bid contributed to a vast ledger of power and survival, revealing the empire in its rawest form.